Yeah, she came to the growth run of Lycée. So she was being intentional. So she was like, oh,
It's not as fancy as it looks. Hi, everybody. Is this on? Woo! All right. Thank you all for being here. We're so excited to have this event and to have you all back here at the Run Center, but we're most excited to have Alison with us today, and I'm going to leave the great introductions to my esteemed colleague, Erica Edwards O'Neill, our Senior Vice President of People, Culture, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Social Responsibility. She's got a lot of things under her hat, but contributes so much, and I'm going to let her do the honors of introducing Alison, but just thank you again. It means so much to our organization. It means so much to our running community, and we're thrilled to have you all here. And for those of you who ran with us, thanks for starting it off.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I am super excited. One, to kind of be out in public. We're out. Can you hear me? Okay? Okay, great. But before I jump in further, I do want to pause to recognize our vendors for tonight, our caterers, Brooklyn Tea, and
so good.
So good, so good. For their amazing tea and wraps, and then the cookies are from Make My Cake in Harlem.
Yum, yum, yum.
Yeah, so. And as we launch in, part of this is we're trying to model the intentionality about what it means to really center equity. And so looking at not just our hiring, our partnering, our marketing, our procurement, but it really means centering equity in everything that we do and trying to deeply embed this work in the DNA of the culture. So that's I'm going to get off my soapbox now. I'm going to focus back on Alison. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Alison Mariella Désir. She is a multi-talented founder, a doer, an activist, a connector, a straightforward communicator with a passion for community health, and now an author of this amazing book, Running While Black. Alison is also the founder of Harlem Run, a New York City-based running movement, and Run for All Women, which has raised over $150,000 for Planned Parenthood and $270,000 for Black Voters Matter. Additionally, because Alison has a lot of jobs, right? Multi-hyphenate. Alison is the co-chair of the newly formed Running Industry Diversity Coalition, a not-for-profit that unites the running industry to provide resources, measure progress, and hold the industry accountable to equitable employment, leadership, ownership, and inclusion, visibility, and access for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so that is just a very brief bio, because Alison, I think a lot of us are here because we know that she is just an amazing human. We're so excited to if you haven't already read or listening to the book, you're in for a treat. We're going to start tonight with a bit of a book talk, reading, and then we'll get into some Q&A. And I'll try to not get in the way too much. Thanks.
Awesome. Should I start with the reading? Okay.
Discuss this, Alison?
Oh, yeah, we didn't talk.
We didn't.
We spent all day together.
We did.
Didn't talk about this.
Day.
But let's do some reading. So I am going to read, let me just find the page. First of all, thank you all for being here. I also want to recognize that Revolution Books is here, which is a bookstore in Harlem, and they are committed to social justice and equity, and I'll be at their shop on November 5th, so stay tuned. I'm going to read a chapter from chapter 7. If you have your books, open up to page 79, A Place for Us. White supremacy has pushed Black people into segregated corners of America for centuries, forcing us to carve out spaces for ourselves. But my favorite thing about us, we can make a way out of no way. There is no shortage of examples where our culture, beauty, and resilience has resulted in some of the most incredible gifts to the world. The Harlem Renaissance, every Black college and university, the Greenwood District, Seneca Village, jazz, hip hop, and civil rights. Running was no different. The desire for space and place led Black runners in Atlanta to create the South Fulton Running Partners in 1979. A couple of friends, Jim Lemon and Jerry McLean, began walking around a high school track for fitness in the city's southwest neighborhood. The walks became runs, and they took their workouts out onto the neighborhood streets. Eventually, they ran local 5Ks and 10Ks and were surprised to see so few Black people in Atlanta, Lemon said in a 2011 story for Runner's World. The two men connected with a few other Black runners at the races and formed the South Fulton Running Partners. They hosted a 5K and supported other clubs that were forming, like the South DeKalb Striders, a majority Black group that formed in Atlanta in the mid-'80s. Other groups followed. The National Black Marathoners Association, founded in 2004 to bring more Black runners to the sport. Black Girls Run in 2009. Black Men Run. Anybody heard of Black Men Run in here? In 2012, shout out to Black Men Run. In 2013, I didn't know about any of these groups. All I knew was that I loved long distance running, yet didn't feel part of the community. So I decided to start a running group in Harlem. There was never any question of where. Even before I lived there through college and graduate school, Harlem had always felt like the center of the universe to me. It was a place where Blackness was celebrated. Street names were named after Black people: Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Adam Clayton Powell. I could walk the neighborhood and see statues of historic Black figures like Mother Clara Hale. It was a place imbued with our history, where thousands of African Americans moved during the Great Migration to escape Jim Crow, where many immigrants, including my parents, landed from the Caribbean and Africa. Malcolm X spoke on the corner of the 1960s. James Brown and Aretha Franklin performed at the Apollo. When I was a child, my parents brought me to Harlem on the weekends for music lessons, and afterwards we'd walk around the neighborhood getting ice cream. Sometimes when we were at home, I'd stare at the black and white photos of my mom and dad hanging out at the Cotton Club and Small's Paradise, wondering why they ever left, wishing I had grown up there, wishing I could be transported to place and time. I took photos of my friends Sasha, Sean, and Kristen running and created a flyer, borrowing my father's nickname for me, Pai Pooj. I called it the Powdered Feet Run Club. Monday nights, 6 p.m., meet at Harlem Yoga Studio. That first night, one person showed but never came back. Then no one came for months. I stood on 125th between Malcolm X and 5th, scanning the street for people dressed in running clothes. After half an hour, I'd sometimes call my mom. "I'm doing this for nothing," I said. "No, you're building a presence," she countered. "People won't come if you're not there. Your consistency matters." And I'll stop right there because that's the beginning of when I started Harlem Run. It was a very lonely time, but that really is what launched me headfirst into the running industry.
Thank you for the reading. And so I'm going to start. I won't jump right in. Sometimes you and I can jump right in. I think that we didn't address this in our earlier session. What led you to running?
Yeah, so in 2012, I was very depressed. My father had Lewy body dementia, and he was 7 years into the diagnosis. And if anybody knows Lewy body dementia, it's really like a slow, terrible wasting away of a human. So my father was no longer able to speak. I was caring for him all the time. On top of that, I was unemployed. I had been dating somebody who was dating me and 10 other people at the same time. And so I was very, very depressed, and I spent all of my days in my bed drinking alcohol, taking sedatives, anything to just get past the day, get on to the next day. But on Facebook, there was a friend of mine, Alade McKen, who was at my launch party on Tuesday, and he was a Black guy, like 6 feet tall, didn't have the body of a runner, but was training for a marathon and was sharing, as we all do, how running was changing his life. And I just became glued to his feed. And I started to ask him questions like, what if you have to poop when you're running? Do you eat food when you're running? And he assured me that I could do it if I wanted to. So the very next year, I signed up for the Rock and Roll San Diego Marathon, and completed that marathon, raised over $5,000 for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And it was like I had unlocked this secret that running can transform not just your physical self, but your mental self. And I felt like it was almost like I was all of a sudden evangelical. I had to share what I learned with the world.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So I've shared with Alison and others as I've read the book that what my initial expectation was that this was a manifesto, right? Also a bit of a like documentary style in book form. And when I received the copy and began to read, it was something completely different. It was historical and also intimate. That was how I framed it as I was speaking to my husband about it. It was moving, it is moving. And so I kind of want to ask why that approach and why was there a pivot, and also what would lead you to be that vulnerable and intimate in this book?
Yeah, it was definitely not my intention to be this vulnerable. Initially, the book was called The Unbearable Whiteness of Running, and it very much was that manifesto style, more in the genre of anti-racism book that I imagined, where it would be mostly history and more instructional. And then like a year into writing that version of the book, my editor was like, you know, what's missing in here is you, right? Like your story is not here. So that led to this shift, and also the shift in the naming. Running While Black, you know, The Unbearable Whiteness of Running centers whiteness. Running While Black centers me and my story. And with that change, I knew that I would have to share parts of myself that are very intimate. You learn a lot about my upbringing. You learn about my relationship with my mother and father, and I take you along that journey with me, particularly discovering that there was nothing wrong with me ever. There was something wrong with white supremacy that was giving me these messages that I was ugly, that I had to work twice as hard, that I was worthless, right? I learned through school that no, there are these systems that really force ourselves to force us to hate ourselves. But with unlocking that, I then realized that there was something I could do about it. So taking folks on that journey with me is it made for a much more powerful book, and I think it leaves readers feeling empowered.
But were you afraid to do so?
Yes, definitely. Particularly because there are, as Black people, as marginalized people, we typically there's very few narratives or ways that we're allowed to be, right? So typically when you think of a Black story, a story of a Black person, it's one of severe trauma, abuse, violence, inner city, right? And that was not my story. But it was nonetheless also one informed by white supremacy and racism. So I wanted to be sure that, I guess I was afraid that in telling my story, people would say, you're not Black enough, because that's actually a message that I received a lot of my life, right? As if being Black means this one story or this one struggle. But I also knew that, you know, my father was somebody who, for whom history was always alive in the room, and you couldn't ask him a question unless you had like 2 hours to hear the history from the beginning of all time. And I thought, you know, if people don't see me at the dinner table with my father, if people don't understand the fact that from the day I was born, he was talking about the Haitian Revolution and how Haiti is the most important country in the world, then they won't understand why I am the way that I am, why I feel comfortable being disruptive and taking chances. So, yeah, I'm still like, that's the thing that makes me a little uneasy, because now so many people know those stories. But again, that's really where the magic is.
And so I was going to go with a different question, but you just brought up the note of history. Yeah. And one of the things that I love about the book is the timeline, and that, again, it is like deeply historical. And one of your lines in the book, it mentions the importance of learning and unlearning, or learning and relearning. And so can you talk a little bit about why it was important for you to center the book also with a historical context?
Yeah, you know, Gary Corbett, who's Ted Corbett's son, he said something once that really resonated with me. He said, history is fragile, easily lost or forgotten. And that's why he's dedicated his life to preserving incredible history. But that very much, in the United States, it's not, there's an intentional miseducation that's happening and has been happening. If you look at recent laws and the move to remove from curriculum anything that makes white people uncomfortable, all of this is part of a larger project of white supremacy, right? Remove the truth, remove the discomfort. We know that history books are not truth, they're just written by the people in power. So I felt like it was really important to provide the context and understanding why it would be that Black people would not feel comfortable in the outdoors. And there were two key dates that started this for me. There was 1963, which many people know as the date that Bill Bowerman held his first run in Eugene at Hayward Fields, and thousands of men, women, and children came. And I remember looking at images of the photos from that, and they were all white. And I started to think about, well, what were Black people doing then? And I remembered, 1963, that was when Martin Luther King Jr. led the March on Washington, right? We didn't get the right to vote until 1968. It wasn't until 1957 that Black people could own property in Eugene, Oregon. So when Bill Bowerman said, just show up, he was only talking to white people, right? Then another date that I know well, because I'm nerdy like that, is 1896, which was the first modern Olympics and the running of the marathon. 1896 was also the year of the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that institutionalized racism, segregation, right? The law that said, we can't walk in the front door, separate is equal. So you juxtapose running history and what I call Black people's reality, and you see that white people are being called to occupy space, and you see that Black people are fighting for the right to go in the front door, visit a national park, visit the public pool, vote, et cetera, et cetera. And yet still, Black people managed to build and define the sport. So I thought, in creating this historical timeline, this is something that it's fact, right? My story, you could look at and say, oh, well, that's her experience and that's her perspective, but this is history, right? Like, Black people were not meant to move freely through space or occupy space in the outdoors. And I thought that was just so essential to help people understand where we come from. And
I know that so far, right, and I believe you're going to have a extraordinarily positive reception, but I know that just as a Black woman, you're going to encounter folks who have not yet established the resiliency to hold or hear the words white supremacy, yes, and racism and Black. Yeah. And so kind of what is your response? Because I'm sure that you've prepared responses.
Well, there's a range of responses. It depends on how I'm feeling. But when I am my best self, I think, first, the way that I tell the book is I take you on this journey with me where you discover that I too struggle with white supremacy, and that I too hold a lot of the ideas that are rooted in white supremacy, whether it's perfectionism, whether it's a smaller body type makes you attractive, whether it's certain hair, whether it's a certain type of speech means that you're smart, right? All of these things are things that, like, I'm also drinking the water, right? So that's one piece of it, helping white people understand that all of us are harmed by white supremacy. The idea of white supremacy and whiteness, it's this intangible ideal that's really rooted in violence and oppression, and each of us is harmed by it. So I try to be empathic, and Rome wasn't built in a day, as the saying goes. But once you develop an awareness, like it's something where once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? And you can. Just like running for a marathon where you train and doesn't necessarily get easier, you get stronger, right? The more you train this awareness of the effects of white supremacy, you become an ally, you get better at it.
Yeah. And that leads me to read one of the lines that stood out to me. on page 207, you say, they insisted that their races were welcoming and open to everyone. So I had to explain that just because white people think that their race or their store or their group or their insert is welcoming doesn't mean it actually is to people of color. And that leads me to a conversation that as I entered running industry, I heard a lot. You just need a pair of shoes, lace up and run. Running is the most democratic sport. And I think we know that, or some of us know that to not be true. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about around, I know that you write in greater detail about why that is not the case.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors, right? I think an essential piece is psychological safety and physical safety. And my book opens up, I take you on a run with me in a town. I live in a small town outside of Seattle that's 2% black, where there are Trump flags everywhere. There are those, what is it, the blue line American flag, and lots of white men with scruffy beards and red hats. And so every time I step outside, I have to grapple with this feeling of, is this gonna be my last run, right? Am I somehow gonna be perceived as a threat, or am I gonna be perceived as somebody who will be forgotten, right? Therefore, I could be taken. Beyond that, you think about the environmental resources that are needed to go out for a run. So part of what I look at in this book, I became consumed with looking at Strava data and comparing Strava data with redline maps. So Strava data, if anybody have Strava in this room? Okay. So Strava accumulates the data and creates what are called heat maps. And the heat maps show where people are participating in particular activities. So no surprise, if you were to look at the Strava heat map data for Manhattan, it'd be blazing around Central Park, right? Because there's a lot of movement there. But if you look at Harlem, there's less heat, and I like to take credit for all the heat that's there. If you look at places in inner cities, if you look at certain parts of Baltimore, there's less heat, right? And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then you compare it to redline maps. Redlining was a practice used by the government to essentially remove black and brown people from neighborhoods. And there's a direct connection between neighborhoods that were red lines, that were divested from, that were dismantled, and a lack of movement, right? So what you see is there is a direct link to these federal policies rooted in racism and white supremacy, and who has the ability to move. You think, again, about things like asthma due to poor air quality. The Bronx is where I lived before I moved to Seattle. The Bronx has some of the worst air pollution, some of the worst sound pollution, some of the most violence, over-policing. I mean, are you really gonna get up for a long run in certain parts of the Bronx, right? So, and of course we know that there are run clubs in the Bronx who are working to address these issues, but all of that goes into who's a long distance runner. It's why in many inner cities, what are the kids playing? They're playing basketball, right? Because it's self-contained, it's on a court. So in order to address who goes out for a run, not only do you have to get the shoes and the gear, you also have to think about these more civic-minded pieces. And who are you electing, and what are the policies that they're making? Where are the resources going? Where are they being removed? And only then do we really have a world where anybody can go for a run.
Thank you. I love that. I have to tell you that was one of the things that I loved when I first interacted with you. My background, I'm a lawyer by training. I've been in the DI space for a long time before it was a popular title, like 18 and a half years. It was like the add-on / this / that. But what I didn't see people talking about, and often in any sport, it is like in isolation. How do we diversify, export soccer, hockey, without understanding that it was a holistic community issue? When I first started in the org, I remember bringing in a redlining group and trying to explain why it was important. And then I spoke to you and I was like, she gets it. You're not running just through, you're running through people's community. right?
And the thing about that is that often when we talk about health, there's this narrative as if, we are responsible for our health, right? So if only we just take better care of ourselves, we'll live longer. Okay, but what about when you live in a place that has pollution, or that's a food desert, or you're an immigrant, therefore you lack papers and you can't get a job, and so then you can't eat well, right? Like those are systems that are preventing you from being your best self. It's not just if you were to like run a few more miles, you would be super healthy, but the world has really turned it against us and made us responsible for our health and responsible for the failures that really go beyond us and that have existed historically.
Absolutely. And then it leaves youth, community, people, humans to try to go back and undiscover or discover the history of how we're still just figuring out how we got here.
Exactly.
And so that's a huge challenge. All right, but I digress. I wanted to pause and just ask, actually, what is your hope for the book? What is your, if you look back in, 2 years, 3 years, or 10 years, what do you hope that this book has done?
Okay, I have 3 hopes.
Got it.
So the first, I hope that it humanizes our experience as Black people, as marginalized people, as anybody who's felt powerless in a space, right? That our experience is humanized. The second, I hope that it inspires people to take intentional action, that people realize that there are things, everyday things that we can do to create change. And the third thing, I hope that this timeline is just the tip of the iceberg, right? That people really start to explore and understand how history plays a part in the present, and therefore can be instructional about our future. So, I think this is a running book, but this is so much more than that. I think that this can be used in classrooms. I think that this can be used in institutions. And I think so many people will feel empowered by it.
And we are going to make time for some Q&A. I won't just be selfish, I promise. But I do want to ask one last question, is that if there is a call to action for folks in this room, for the industry, for New York Roadrunners, what is it?
Well, I'm not going to give one for New York Roadrunners because I already gave you all a list earlier.
Okay. We took it down.
But I think one thing, and it sounds simple, but I think developing an awareness of the privileges that you hold and the rooms that you're in. For many of us, the identities that give us privilege, we are taught to take them for granted, right? Whether that's, in my case, ability status, the fact that I'm cis, the fact that I'm heterosexual, those are things that are so, because I have the privilege and I'm seen as the default in all of the spaces because of those identities, I don't take it for granted, or I take it for granted. I don't think about the fact that sometimes I'm hosting events and there's only stairs, therefore lots of people won't be able to attend, right? Sometimes I look at the language that I'm using and I recognize that that's not language that would be inclusive of all genders, right? So I would advocate that start to look around you, see who's in the room and see who's not in the room, and be curious as to why that is. And sometimes you find the answer to that question and you realize you don't have the resources, maybe the energy, the bandwidth to do anything about it. But other times, you realize that you are exactly the person to do something about that. So I advocate for awareness and curiosity, and I'm always down to talk with folks who are curious. It's people who are intentionally harmful that I disengage with. But curious questions, I mean, that's the only way that we get to know each other and create meaningful change.
Thank you. All righty. So, all right, this is the time. I'm gonna share the mic. We have time for a few questions.
Questions, thoughts?
Yeah, right. Comments. Yeah, no, not all at once. I know they're out there. Come on.
Hi, Alison. Thank you. Thank you for your talk today and for your book. There's a fundamental tension between what one could call the Martin Luther King philosophy and approach to race relations and the Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey approach, which is more of a separatist approach. And both are highly understandable, and as a white person of privilege, something that I approach as a matter of, that's not something that I experienced directly, but I'm wondering in terms of your philosophy, your insight, what are your views of those two aspects and approaches to race relations?
What was your word you used? You said there's a fundamental...
There's a fundamental difference in approach between the
Right, yeah, no, I was trying to remember the word you said because I disagree. I don't think that there's a fundamental difference between those approaches. I think, first of all, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were good friends, and their families remain good friends, and they always supported each other in love. That's part of some of the erasure and miseducation that we get, that in school we learn that Martin Luther King was a pacifist and was, this sanitized version of himself, when in fact he was so dangerous, they killed him. And we learned that Martin Luther King was the burn it all down guy. But I would encourage you to dig deeper. The other thing that I'll say is that I believe in both approaches. In this book, I talk about the way that the industry, the white-led running industry, must create change. But I also say, whether you do it or not, we're creating our own institutions. And the way that that demographics are shifting, where by 2040, white people will no longer be the majority, we will soon you will need to court our dollars and our support to be powerful. Right? So I think it's not either or, it's both, right? We need our own institutions. The founder of Mid-Strike Magazine was here before, which is a magazine by and for Black and brown people. So we both need that, and we also need Runner's World to center our stories. I don't think that they're fundamentally opposed to one another.
I just wanted to add, specifically for digging deeper on that particular question, I would encourage you to explore a documentary called King in the Wilderness. It's a much more three-dimensional view of Dr. King, his relationships, his perspective, and many more speeches. So one of his famous, the quote around it is, I think it's cruel to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps. But what we often hear from Dr. King is I have a dream and let's all hold hands. And I think that the notion around history is that we really are having to dig for a complete unfolded history to understand how we are and why we think what we think. Other questions?
Yes. Oh, you need the microphone. I'm like, I could just point at you. Okay, no, here it comes.
Hi, Headley from the Bronx, Pints and Pavements, runner. I just wanted to say thank you for writing this book. This is going to be my first marathon, and in the process of learning and going through all of the training and learning from other runners and learning from their experiences and learning, where they run, where they don't run. And as a Black man running through the city, I forget sometimes the privilege that I also have, that I can run at night with no lights, and that I can run in the street with the cars and run all over the city. But the women in my group don't have the same privilege. And your book is very important. That's the comment I have.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I was actually speaking to somebody. I don't want to out this person, but there's an event that's happening that's about runner safety, and that's in response to what happened to Eliza Fletcher. And a few things came to mind. One, it's devastating what happened to her, but the same man actually attacked a Black woman 6 to 9 months prior, nobody believed her story, which is why he was out and able to murder Eliza Fletcher. Then the other piece is that on this event, on this panel, there's a white woman, there's an Asian woman, there's a black man and a white man, and there's no black woman, right? And what often happens, and I talk about this in the book, you know, Malcolm X said the most disrespected woman in America is the black woman, the most unprotected woman in America is the black woman, and our stories are not advocated for or elevated because we bear the brunt of white supremacy and patriarchy. So I never want to put our experiences, I never want to put them against each other, but it is important, as you said, that we recognize, I recognize the privilege that I have, as I mentioned, my education, my ability status, and yeah, I mean, my husband will go running he thinks 10 o'clock at night is the perfect time to run, and I'm like, are you kidding me, right? But that is, it's important for us to share and understand these varied experiences. Thank you.
Hi, Allison.
Hi,
I want to
Maria.
thank you for writing this book. So I want to share something with you guys. I love my job. I work for New York Roadrunners. I didn't come to running till 12 years ago. I was born in the 50s. On my birth certificate, it says, I am a colored person. We've come a long way. Thank you for bringing us even further.
Thank you, Maria. I don't even recognize you. Like, you're a human with a suit on.
I'm not sure exactly how to take that.
You were usually in spandex. I only know you running.
I should have worn the heart sunglasses too. But thank you. Appreciate you coming and speaking. And also, haven't finished it yet, but thoroughly enjoying. I want to say one thing that I really appreciated is being able to communicate in a way that is already been mentioned so vulnerably. I'm in recovery as well, and so talking about things that allows me to identify instead of comparing. And I really appreciate that because you and I don't share a lot of background. We have some overlap, but not a lot. But it really allowed me to kind of connect with what you were trying to say. So I thought that was very helpful. So thank you. Very well done. I wanted to highlight the work that you're doing in the RIDC. I think it's very important, especially like my club. We have a lot of higher earning folks who have income that they can use to make a difference by focusing that income in different places. Understanding that you are affiliated with certain brands in that RIDC in the work that you're doing. I just wanted to ask, are there any companies, especially locally, like I'm a big fan of trying to support local New York businesses. We currently use Tracksmith as one of our jersey providers in my club. I don't like that. I would prefer there are several local New York-based companies that I mean, it's good stuff, but it's elitist. It's
You're saying it, not me.
I will call it out. It makes me uncomfortable seeing not only the income message that's being sent in Tracksmith's advertising, but the body image that's being put forth that you have to have a certain type of body in order to be cool enough to run in Tracksmith clothing, as somebody who also used to weigh 320 pounds. So I was just interested, are there any brands that you would like to call out that we should be targeting with our dollars to kind of support the mission that they're doing, the work that they're doing, that maybe isn't really known in the wider running community right now?
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that with this crowd, because that took some vulnerability as well. There are two brands that come to mind that I love. The first is Pioneers, started by Sidney Baptiste, who also started a run crew called Pioneer Run Club in Boston. Pioneers, PYNRS, and he's incredible. I mean, he has this vision of a running streetwear brand that's for us, by us, and it's beautiful to watch his journey. The other brand is called Actively Black, and it was started, I think, by a professional athlete. I don't know if he was a football player, basketball player, I forget his story, but his clothing is beautiful. He actually, there's gonna be like a Marvel Black Panther collection, but what you see through his, if you follow Actively Black and then you'll find his personal Instagram, you read the obstacles that he has as a black man creating this brand, the ways that which even Instagram targets some of his content and marks it as inappropriate because of the slogans that he's using that are pro-black, right? and not harmful, just proud. So yeah, those are the two that come to mind. There are also a lot of women-owned brands that I can't think of top of mind, but yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? That we are making clothing that is for us, fits our aesthetic, fits our body, and that, of course, everybody's welcome to purchase, but we are in the center of it.
Hi, can you see me? Hi, Allison. Thank you. Can't wait to read the book. Very excited about that. Also a Bronx runner, Bronx Soul, Bronx Femme Run. I just want to thank you for this, and also for your consistency with Harlem Run, because I also think that was a catalyst for a lot of the Bronx running groups. I think that's where it started. I came back to running just right before the pandemic, actually. This will also be my first marathon in 17 days. So I just want to say thank you for that. Just also, it's very, I think, important for us to be out there. With this being like my first real year of running, especially a lot of road runner races, not seeing a lot of us out there, but I think it's important for us to be out there, to be seen. Being a Bronx runner, running in the streets, a lot of brown and black people out there. They don't see that in the streets as
Right.
well. I run in
Right.
the South Bronx, and we have a ton of running groups in the Bronx, but I really think it is important for them to see us, to know that we are out there being fit. I run in Central Park, not as much, but a lot of times I don't see people like me.
Right.
The races, I don't see people like me. So I still think that it is very important for us to be out there, to be seen. As a woman, I think it's important to be seen. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for this book. I hope people get a lot from it. And I just can't wait to read it. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're gonna love, there's a chapter, my favorite chapter, Everything is Connected, where I give a major shout out to the crews in the Bronx. Just the slogan of Not 62 and the way that all of these crews have taken it as a personal, call to action, right, to be part of shifting the narrative. So thank you.
Hi, my question was if there was one or two things that we could do as adults to help the younger generation of kids of color into this sport, what would they be? What would it look like? What would it sound like?
Yeah, I think it depends on what role you have. A coach asked me when I was in Minneapolis, a white cross-country coach was saying, the kids who show up, they're all white kids. Like, what do I do to get kids? So I think if you're a teacher or a coach, never, and I don't know what your role is, but I think about how impactful teachers and coaches were in my life who saw something in me or maybe pretended to see something in me, whichever it was, and invited me to join the track team, invited me to try singing, right? You never know the impact that you're making, so encouraging kids to try things. Another coach that I was talking to was saying that for him, one of the things that he did was ask parents, well, what is the obstacle, right? Because sometimes you just don't know, and what he found was that the obstacle for many kids was that the parents were working, therefore couldn't pick them up after practices, so if they didn't take the bus home, that was it. So this coach took it upon himself to start carpooling and driving all the kids. That adds 2-3 hours to his day, but he realized that could be his contribution. So yeah, I think even getting parents involved and understanding, we make a lot of assumptions about what's stopping people from doing things or why they're not considering things. So asking the question and then figuring out, well, what is that simple solution of carpooling 10 kids? There could be future Olympians, marathoners in that car. You know what I mean?
That's huge. I just wanted to add that's so interesting that we didn't talk about this today, but I'm out on Long Island. My we're in a majority white school. I have twin girls, and they are sprinters. And we were looking for them to be in shape during the season and said, look, we're going to go out and you're going to do cross country. And when we showed up, we were like, it's the same coaches. Why didn't they invite you? It's the exact same coaches. And like one is still like, I'm not doing that, Mom. And the other, though, has been on cross country for 3 years and is looking to continue. But it was the simple ask, right? They weren't showing up. All the girls in cross country were white, and the majority of the girls in sprint were black and brown. And it was simply their showing up. There's like a much more diverse team now, simply because they were invited, or they invited themselves, they were voluntold by their parents. So,
Exactly.
So,
Okay, you'll go and then.
okay. Cynthia here from We Run Uptown. I just want to thank you so much for paving the way. I've been running for about 12 years, and I didn't call myself or identify as a runner until 10 years, right? 10 years of running, and it was until 2 years ago I didn't call myself a runner. And it wasn't until, mainly because I didn't see people like me. But then I joined a club uptown, and like that changed, right? Running was not just about running, it was about the community. And I think that's the piece that was missing for me for all this time. So one, I want to thank you for that. And just reading in page 79 where you said you were calling your mom, like, Mom, this is all for nothing.
Yes.
Just want to say that it wasn't for nothing, because all these crews have popped up, and the running game has changed so tremendously, right? I was recently featured, my story was recently featured in Runner's World magazine. And it took thank you. I mean, I'm really proud of the piece, because running has changed my career trajectory. I was in the public health field for 10 years, and I became an urban planner because of running.
Awesome.
And just like even using the Strava data, right? I've done that analysis and seen all the different how the different crews have activated spaces, and even how running has changed. If you look at 10 years ago, running has completely changed. And we're not there yet, but it's like moments like this where we kind of step back, reflect, and really use what we've got, the resources. So I want to just commend you. I
Yeah.
thank you for doing what you do.
You are welcome. Thank you for that.
Hi, Alison. Yes, so I actually will be running my first marathon in whatever days it is. I'm born and raised in Queens. One of the things I've noticed, I got in the marathon pure luck through the lottery. But what I've noticed is that it's really expensive, and if not, the New York City Marathon is among the most expensive marathons to get into. And with training and everything, before I even set foot on that day, I probably will have spent upwards of like $1,000 between PT and everything. So I wonder, what do you think needs to be done to level the playing field, so to speak? Because I've watched marathons in New York City growing up in the Queens, and not seeing that many people that look like us that are running, right? And it's pretty coincidental that we are in New York Road Runners, right? And you know, all the work that they have done. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. That's the other question. One question I have for you, and the other question is, you know, being able to run, and I've seen so many different crews throughout New York City. But I've also noticed that there's a lot of crews that have a lot of privilege, right? Like, I won't name them, but there are some crews that hold a lot of power, and they hold a lot of sponsors, and they keep that to themselves, and they don't spread the equity out to other people. I know that's true. There are some groups that do that. I think, if there are some groups that are in this room, what do you suggest they do to make sure that they spread the equity to others? Because that is a thing. I do see it all the time.
You're putting me on the spot here. No, I appreciate the question. Well, I'll start with the first, because we are in this space and we actually have folks who can speak to that. I know that New York Road Runners, there's a race-free program that I'll give to Erica to speak more about. But I think you're right. It's absolutely essential that we address the economic obstacles, right? Even a piece of this that we were talking about today was the fact that for so long you could only purchase races using a credit card, right? And think about all that it takes to be able to access a credit card. Cash was not an option, right? So that simple fact of accepting cash for races has invited a new population to participate. I think that there's a big responsibility for brands and corporations to make it accessible for us to run, and that's part of the work of the Running Industry Diversity Coalition. One piece, there's a lot of what we do, but one piece is looking at how do we create greater access for runners to do the thing that they love and to participate in sport. I want to pass it to Erica to talk about this program specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to the notion of to accepting cash, Race Free is actually not a new program. It has been in place for many years. I know that Christine Burke in the House and Karen, and actually overseen in part by the wonderful team here at the Run Center. So, but this year we paused, pulled it down, revamped it, reviewed the application, and tried to make sure that we simplified the application, that we pushed out promotions and marketing around it, that we were informing folks, and also that we were centering and ensuring that there were folks in New York City that were going to benefit from this. And that's one small step. But I do want to pause to say that in these spaces, often like the person of color or the DEI person gets credit for that. These things don't move if you don't have other senior leaders and a CEO who is willing to make the move. And so some of these things I take credit for, but it was actually Karen Hempel came in, and in the first few weeks we're like, why aren't we accepting cash? What are we doing? We're Race Free. So it is never just a one-person thing. It is this work and this movement happens in partnership and with people who are willing to do the courageous, to avoid the historical hangover and move through. Again, that's my soapbox. I'm saying that is not solving all of the issues, right, but we are trying to move the needle a little bit at a time. And so this is interesting because I don't know what we're always open to other suggestions, recommendations, but those are the two that we've been focusing on for the last few months.
And then to your second question, I think a lot of what happens when brands start partnering with community groups is that one, and I can say this as somebody who has had lots of relationship with brands, is we sign these contracts where we have like NDAs and we can't really share anything about what's happening within the partnership. And in that, we don't know how to advocate for ourselves, right? Like there are so many people who have these brand partnerships who are not being paid anything, who are given just gear, who are appearing in marketing, and that is work. I don't know anybody who works for free, but there are people who are working for sneakers, for their crew name on a Nike shirt. They're in marketing campaigns where they're alongside models who are getting a daily rate, who are being paid $500 a day, and they're getting paid in an Instagram post, right? So that's one piece of it, and it feels like this scarcity. It feels like when a brand gives you attention, it feels like you are so lucky to get their attention that you become a crab in a barrel, and you want to make sure that you keep that attention to yourself, right? I've for a long time said to different leaders, like, we should have a union where we say that we will not, if a brand approaches us, we will not work for any less than $250 an hour, right? But if I say that, and then Bronx Soul says, oh my God, I'll do it for sneakers, then we all lose our footing, right? So I think brands have historically, in the city, they've pitted us against each other. They've forced us to remain silent about what money or not money is being exchanged. And I don't think that people are intentionally meaning to be selfish. I just think that people are so afraid of losing their moment. And if only we shared more information, right? Like, and this is what, if you look at Alicia Montano, Kara Goucher, the women who went up against Nike, who at one point they started this Google document where they were putting what their contract terms were. It was this anonymous Google Doc that they were all sharing, and they were realizing that all of their contracts were terrible. All of their contracts had clauses where they would lose money for being pregnant, et cetera, and that allowed them to rally and say, okay, we're outing Nike and we're no longer tolerating this treatment. So, I think it really is up to all of us to create a sense of trust and accountability with each other, so that we can actually, we need money for our communities. We deserve to be paid for our likeness and for our work, but I just don't think the New York running scene as a whole is there yet.
Are we over time? Is that what you're saying? I think this might need to be the last question.
This is a perfect segue, because you and I have worked together a lot at various brands.
Yes.
So I just want everyone to know how important you've been to that journey as far as the brands are concerned. And that predates the RIDC, right? The work that we did together and made hopefully the brands I've worked with and me personally much better.
Yeah.
So it's just, again, deep, heartfelt thanks for all the work.
Thank you, Russell.
And all the RIDC and everything else. So it's
Thank you.
We try to do the best.
And
we
this
can.
this guy, he is everybody's supporter. So I don't know how he. I was just talking to his wife. Apparently, he comes home and doesn't talk to anybody once he gets home because he spends all day talking to us. But you know, like you look for the helpers. You look for the people who are going to. At times risk their own job and position to tell you what it is and to tell you like that's actually not a good deal. You know what I mean? So look for those folks, and hopefully I can be that to as many people as possible too.
Awesome. What time is it? Okay, yeah, we're over time. This has been wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you, Alison, for writing the book, for giving time and space, for holding us accountable, for sharing your knowledge and information. And I didn't do a great job of selling because I'm assuming everybody in this room has a book or 2 or 3 or 4. Buy, post, share. We do want this to be a book that is making the impact, and we want to be talking next year about your hopes, the 3, and where we've moved the needle on those hopes for the book.
And you can buy it right now, and I will be signing books over here.
Right.
So thank you all so much for your time tonight.